Today, we will be focusing on true-false not given questions in the reading test. Although we will only be doing true-false not given questions in this video, in reality, you really shouldn't do each type of question one by one. I mean, don't read the paragraphs and only do the first type of question, because when you do the second type of question, you will have to read all these paragraphs all over again. In order to avoid reading a paragraph multiple times, we really should do all types of questions at the same time. I highly recommend also checking out this video of mine. It's about the overall strategy of the reading test. It shows you how to handle all types of questions at the same time so that you can avoid reading a paragraph multiple times and finish all 40 questions in less than an hour. I will put a link in the description. Don't forget to check it out. Now, let's get started with today's lesson and crush those true-false not given questions. All three passages in this reading test contain true-false not given questions. Let's do all of them. For some types of questions, we should read the paragraphs first and then read the questions. For example, for matching information, we should read the paragraphs first. But for true-false not given questions, we should read the questions first and then read the paragraphs. The first time we read a question, we only need to go through it quickly. We don't need to analyze it in detail because we won't be able to remember all this information, right? Right now, we only need to go through it quickly. The purpose is to find the words that can help us locate the answer in the passage. Let's call these words locating words. So locating words are usually people's names, place names, book names, or time references. For example, for question 1, forest problems of Mediterranean countries are to be discussed at the next meeting of experts. It contains a place name. It mentions these countries, right? So we can use these countries as the locating words. So why do we use names or time references as locating words? Of course, other words can also help us locate the answer in the passage, right? For example, for question 4, the biological functions of forests were recognized only in the 20th century. This question is about biological functions of forests. It's about biological functions, right? So we can definitely use biological functions as the locating words. However, which one is easier to remember, biological functions or the 20th century? Of course, 20th century is much easier to remember than biological functions, right? Remember I said earlier, we shouldn't only do one type of question at a time. We should do all types of questions in a passage at the same time. This passage has 3 types of questions in total. That is to say, we need to remember all 3 types of questions locating words. That's a lot to remember. That's why if they are time references or names, we should definitely use them as locating words because they are easy to remember. Now, we have found the locating words of this question. Let's read the first paragraph. But while reading, you shouldn't be focusing only on guiding Mediterranean countries. You should also try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph. Because if you read only the sentence that contains the answer without any other context, it will be very hard for you to understand that sentence. Besides, we read a paragraph not just to do one question. As I said, we should do all types of questions at the same time, right? That is to say, we read a paragraph in order to do all 3 types of questions at the same time. That's why we should try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph. Now, I will play the audio. You try to find if this paragraph mentions Mediterranean countries, and at the same time try to understand the rough meaning of this paragraph, okay?
Forests are one of the main elements of our natural heritage. The decline of Europe's forests over the last decade and a half has led to an increasing awareness and understanding of the serious imbalances which threaten them. European countries are becoming increasingly concerned by major threats to European forests, threats which know no frontiers other than those of geography or climate. Air pollution, soil deterioration, the increasing number of forest fires, and sometimes even the mismanagement of our woodland and forest heritage. There has been a growing awareness of the need for countries to get together to coordinate their policies. In December 1990, Strasbourg hosted the first ministerial conference on the protection of Europe's forests. The conference brought together 31 countries from both Western and Eastern Europe. The topics discussed included the coordinated study of the destruction of forests, as well as how to combat forest fires and the extension of European research programs on the forest ecosystem. The preparatory work for the conference had been undertaken at 2 meetings of experts. Their initial task was to decide which of the many forest problems of concern to Europe involve the largest number of countries and might be the subject of joint action. Those confined to particular geographical areas, such as countries bordering the Mediterranean or the Nordic countries, therefore had to be discarded. However, this does not mean that in future they will be ignored.
Did you find these countries in the paragraph? Here it mentions Mediterranean countries. So we have found the locating word. Now let's read the question again because we have probably forgotten what this question is about. This time we need to read it carefully. Forest problems of Mediterranean countries are to be discussed at the next meeting of experts. Now let's read this sentence and see if it mentions these problems will be discussed at the next meeting. It says, those confined to particular geographical areas, such as countries bordering the Mediterranean or the Nordic countries, therefore had to be discarded. Although it mentions Mediterranean countries, it doesn't mention forest problems, right? However, don't choose not given yet. Sometimes sentences that contain answers don't directly mention keywords in the questions. It sometimes uses reference words like those, this, it, or they to make it harder for us to find the answers. So we need to find out what those refers to. It may refers to forest problems. Let's read the preceding sentence. Their initial task. The task refers to the task of this conference, right? So the conference initial task was to decide which of the many forest problems of concern to Europe involve the largest number of countries and might be the subject of joint action. Those confined to particular geographical areas. Those does refer to the forest problems. So here it actually says forest problems which were confined to Mediterranean countries, therefore had to be discarded. However, this doesn't mean that in future they will be ignored. This sentence is the answer, right? Here they refers to those, and those refers to the forest problems of Mediterranean countries. So this sentence is actually saying this doesn't mean that in future forest problems of Mediterranean countries will be ignored. Which one is the answer? Not given is the answer. Those problems may be ignored or they may not be ignored. We don't know, so the answer is not given. This one is not very hard. Before we continue, I want to quickly introduce our 3-day writing test 2 challenge. This challenge has helped many of our students get the score they need for the writing test. For example, this student got a 7 in writing after completing the challenge. And this student improved from 5.5 to 6.5 after completing the challenge. There are even students who improved to 7.5 in writing. This one, she was getting 6.5, but after completing the challenge, she improved to 7.5. So in this challenge, each day you watch a video, do your homework, and most importantly, we will provide feedback on your work. I will put a link in the pinned comment. Don't forget to check it out. Let's move on to question 2. The method is the same. We quickly go through the question and find the locating word. Problems in Nordic countries were excluded because they are outside the European Economic Community. Here it mentions a place name, so we can definitely use these countries to locate the answer in the passage. Earlier, we have already read this paragraph. Here it mentions Nordic countries, so now we should read the question again carefully. Problems in Nordic countries were excluded because they are outside the European Economic Community. Obviously, this part doesn't mention European Economic Community, right? It doesn't mention Europe's economy. But don't just choose not given. Although it doesn't mention Europe's economy, it does clearly explain why problems in Nordic countries were excluded, were not discussed. Notice that here it uses therefore. Therefore, problems in Nordic countries had to be discarded. That is to say, this is the result, this is the consequence, right? So the preceding test must be the reason. This must be the reason why problems in Nordic countries were excluded. Let's read it carefully. Those confined to particular geographical areas, such as countries bordering the Mediterranean or the Nordic countries, therefore had to be discarded. Through the word confined, we can note that their problems were not discussed because their problems were confined, were limited to only a few particular countries. If you are not certain about it, you can read back. Here it says their initial task was to decide which of the manifold problems of concern to Europe involved the largest number of countries. So in this meeting, they discuss only the problems that involved the largest number of countries, and the problems which were confined were limited to only a few particular countries, therefore had to be discarded, right? So the problems were excluded not because of this. The problems were excluded because of this, because their problems were confined, were limited to only a few countries. So the answer is false. I think this question is quite hard. Although it doesn't mention Europe's economy, it does clearly explain why problems in Nordic countries were excluded, right? Okay, next one. First, quickly go through the question and find the locating words. Forests are renewable source of raw material. So this question doesn't contain time references or names. What should we do? In this case, we can use special words to locate the answer. But what are special words? Obviously, we shouldn't use forest to locate the answer because the entire passage is about forests. Renewable source and raw material are more special. We can use either of them to locate the answer. I'm gonna choose renewable source as the locating words. Now let's read the second paragraph. You try to find if the paragraph mentions renewable source or raw material, and at the same time try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph, okay?
As a whole, European countries see forests as performing a triple function: biological, economic, and recreational. The first is to act as a green lung for our planet. By means of photosynthesis, forests produce oxygen through the transformation of solar energy, thus fulfilling what for humans is the essential role of an immense, non-polluting power plant. At the same time, forests provide raw materials for human activities through their constantly renewed production of wood.
So here it mentions raw material. Now let's read the question again carefully. Forests are a renewable source of raw material. Now let's read this sentence and see if forests are a renewable source or not. Forests provide raw materials for human activities through their constantly renewed production of wood. Yes, forests are a renewable source. Usually, if a question is true, it uses different words to rephrase the paragraph. For example, renewable source is a rephrase of renewed production, and the raw material is a rephrase of wood. Wood is a raw material, right? This question is easy. Obviously, the answer is true. Next one. The biological functions of forests were recognized only in the 20th century. Obviously, we can use the time 20th century to locate the answer. Now, let's continue reading this paragraph and see if it mentions 20th century.
Finally, they offer those condemned to spend 5 days a week in an urban environment an unrivaled area of freedom to unwind and take part in a range of leisure activities, such as hunting, riding, and hiking. The economic importance of forests has been understood since the dawn of man. Wood was the first fuel. The other aspects have been recognized only for a few centuries, but they are becoming more and more important. Hence, there is a real concern throughout Europe about the damage to the forest environment, which threatens these three basic roles.
It doesn't mention 20th century, does it? But here it does mention centuries, so maybe this part contains the answer. Let's read the question again. This time read it carefully. The biological functions of forests were recognized only in the 20th century. This question is about biological functions of forests, right? Now let's read the text and see if it mentions biological functions. The other aspects have been recognized only for a few centuries, but they are becoming more and more important. Hence, there is a real concern throughout Europe about the damage to the forest environment, which threatens these three basic roles. This part doesn't directly mention biological functions, but I still think it's very likely that this contains the answer because it looks very similar to the question. The question says, recognized only in the 20th century, and here it says, recognized only for a few centuries. They look very similar, right? So we must find out what other aspects refer to. Maybe it refers to biological functions. As I said earlier in the video, sometimes the sentence that contains the answer doesn't directly mention the keywords in the question. It sometimes uses reference words like it, they, or other aspects to refer to the keywords in the question. So we need to read backwards to find out if other aspect refers to biological functions. As you can see here, it mentions three functions of forests. It says, European countries see forests as performing a triple function, biological, economic, and recreational. And the sentence before this sentence mentions the economic importance, which refers to the economic function. That is to say, the other aspects must refer to the remaining two aspects, biological and the recreational functions, right? So this part is indeed about the biological functions of forests. It actually says, the biological functions have been recognized only for a few centuries. Only for a few centuries. It has to be more than 2 centuries to be counted as a few centuries, right? That is to say, the biological functions have been recognized before the 20th century, not only in the 20th century. The question contradicts the paragraph, so the answer is false. Next one, natural forests still exists in parts of Europe. So this question doesn't contain any time references or place names. Which word do you think we can use to locate the answer? Obviously, we shouldn't use forests or Europe to locate the answer because the whole passage is about forests in Europe, right? I think natural is a very special word, although the entire passage is about forests, but not every paragraph is about natural forests, so I'm gonna use this word to locate the answer. As we read the next paragraph, we will notice that it mentions natural forests right at the beginning of the paragraph. So let's read this sentence carefully and see if it mentions natural forests still exists in parts of Europe. The myth of the natural forest has survived, yet there are effectively no remaining primary forests in Europe. All European forests are artificial, haven't been adapted and exploited by man for thousands of years. I think here primary forest mean the same as natural forest. It says no remaining natural forests, but the question says natural forests still exist. They contradict each other, right? So I think the answer is false. And the following sentence says, all European forests are artificial, meaning there are no natural forests left. So I think false is the answer. Next one, forest policy should be limited by national boundaries. Which word do you think is special? Obviously, we shouldn't use forest. I think policy and the national boundaries are both special, but which word is easier to remember? Policy, right? This word is shorter and so it's easier to remember. Besides, this question is mainly about policy instead of national boundaries, right? So I'm gonna use policy to locate the answer. As we continue reading, we will notice that it mentions policy right here. It says, this means that the forest policy is vital, that it must transcend the national frontiers and the generations of people. Here, it refers to the policy, right? The policy must transcend the national frontiers. Transcend means go beyond. The policy must go beyond the national frontiers. But the question says the policy must be limited by national boundaries. National boundaries mean the same as national frontiers. The paragraph says transcend the national frontiers, But the question says limited by national frontiers, so obviously the answer is false. Last one. Obviously, we can use the name of the conference to locate the answer. So now we don't need to read the question, we only need to highlight this word. As you can see here, it mentions this conference. So now let's read the question carefully. The conference decided that the forced policy must allow for the possibility of change. Here it says, the conference was one of the first events on such a scale to reach this conclusion. What does this conclusion refer to? We need to find out what this conclusion refers to because as I said many times, sometimes the sentence that contains the answer doesn't directly mention the keywords in the question. It sometimes uses reference words like it, they, or this to refer to the keywords. So if we read backwards, we will know that this conclusion refers to the conclusion of this. It must allow for the inevitable changes that take place in the forests, in needs, and hence in policy. Allow for the inevitable changes means the same as allow for the possibility of change, right? So the answer is true. The rest of the paragraph also talks about the policy allowing for the possibility of change, but we are not going to read it in this video. Part 1 is done. Hope you guys continue watching because part 2 and 3 are harder. So the first step is to quickly go through the question and find the locating word. The written record for cosmetics and perfumes dates back to the 3rd BC. Obviously, we can use this time to locate the answer. Now, I will play the audio for the first paragraph. You try to find out if this paragraph mentions this time, and at the same time, try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph, okay?
Since cosmetics and perfumes are still in wide use today, it is interesting to compare the attitudes, customs, and beliefs related to them in ancient times to those of our own day and age. Cosmetics and perfumes have been popular since the dawn of civilization. It is shown by the discovery of a great deal of pertinent archaeological material, dating from the 3rd millennium BC.
As you can see, here it mentions 3rd BC. So now we need to read the question again, this time read it carefully. The written record for cosmetics and perfumes dates back to the 3rd BC. I think a written record is very important. Let's read this part carefully and see if it also mentions written record. It says, it is shown by the discovery of a great deal of archaeological material dating back from the 3rd BC. So this sentence says, archaeological material dates from the 3rd BC. But it doesn't mention written record, right? We can't tell if archaeological material includes written record or not. So it seems we should choose not given, but let's continue reading and see if the remaining paragraph mentions written record or not.
Mosaics, glass perfume flasks, stone vessels, ovens, cooking pots, clay jars, etc. Some inscribed by the hand of the artisan evidence also appears in the Bible and other classical writings, where it is written that spices and perfumes were prestigious products known throughout the ancient world and coveted by kings and princes. The written and pictorial descriptions, as well as archaeological findings, all show how important body care and aesthetic appearance were in the lives of the ancient people. The chain of evidence spans many centuries, detailing the usage of cosmetics in various cultures from the earliest period of recorded history.
As you can see, here it says writing and here it says written, so maybe this part is about written record. Let's read it. Evidence also appears in the Bible and other classical writings, where it is written that spices and perfumes. Yes, I think this is about written record for cosmetics and perfumes. But does this written record dates back to 3rd BC? It says where it is written that spices and perfumes were prestigious products known throughout the ancient world and was by kings and princes. I think this is saying written record for cosmetics and perfumes show that spices and perfumes were prestigious products. It doesn't say whether the written record dates back to the 3rd BC or not, right? So it's still not given. But let's continue reading because the following sentence is also about written record. The written and words descriptions, as well as archaeological findings, all show how important body care were in the lives of ancient people. So this sentence is saying written record shows that body care were important in the lives of the ancient people, right? It still doesn't mention whether the written record dates back to the 3rd BC or not, so the answer is actually not given. The text that mentions written record says nothing about the 3rd BC, right? And the text that talks about the 3rd BC says nothing about written record. We only know archaeological material dates back to the 3rd BC. We don't know if the written record dates from the 3rd BC or not, so the answer is not given. This one is not easy. Next one. Since perfumes and spices were luxury products, their use was exclusive to the noble and the wealthy. There are no time references or place names, so which word do you think we can use to locate the answer? Which word do you think is special? We obviously shouldn't use perfumes and spices to locate the answer, because the whole passage is about cosmetics, is about perfumes and spices, right? I think luxury products and the noble and the wealthy are both special words. But the information in the may clause is definitely more important than the information in the other clause. This question is mainly about whether the use of perfumes and the spices was exclusive to the noble and the wealthy, rather than whether perfumes and spices were luxury products, right? So this information is definitely more important. I'm gonna use this to locate the answer. Earlier, we have already read the first paragraph. This paragraph already mentions the noble and wealthy. Here it says kings and princes. These are wealthy people, right? Let's read this sentence again. It is written that spices and perfumes were prestigious products known throughout the ancient world and worked by kings and princes. Although I don't know what this word means, I don't think this sentence discusses only wealthy people can use perfumes and spices. This sentence is mainly about spices and perfumes were prestigious products. It doesn't say whether they were used only by wealthy people, right? So maybe the answer is not given. Let's just choose not given for now and mark this question. If we find the noble and the wealthy in the following paragraphs, we will do this question again. Paragraph B doesn't mention the noble and the wealthy, but paragraph C does. Here it uses the exact same words, the noble and the wealthy. So now let's read the question again. Let's read it carefully. Since perfumes and spices were luxury products, their use was exclusive to the noble and the wealthy. Now I'm going to play the audio for paragraph C. You try to find out which option should we choose.
Perfumes and fragrant spices were precious commodities in antiquity, very much in demand, and at times even exceeded silver and gold in value. Therefore, they were luxury products, used mainly in the temples and in the homes of the noble and the wealthy. The Judean kings kept them in treasure houses, and the Queen of Sheba brought to Solomon camels laden with spices, gold in great quantity, and precious stones. However, within time, the use of cosmetics became the custom of that period. The use of cosmetics became widespread among the lower classes as well as among the wealthy. In the same way they washed the body, so they used to care for the body with substances that softened the skin and anoint it with fragrant oils and ointments.
What does this sentence say? It says they were luxury products. They refers to perfumes and spices, right? Perfumes and spices were luxury products. It says the same thing as this clause, right? Used mainly in the temples and in the homes of the noble and the wealthy. So perfumes and spices were used mainly by the noble and the wealthy, not only by the noble and the wealthy. And as we continue reading, we will find the answer is even more obvious. Here it says, the use of cosmetics became widespread among the lower classes as well as among the wealthy. That means the lower class also used perfumes and spices, not just the wealthy, right? So the answer is false. Let's remove the mark. Next one. In ancient Far East, Here it mentions a place name, so we don't need to continue reading the question. We only need to highlight it. We read the question only after we find the Far East in the passage, right? Now, I'm going to play the audio for paragraph D. You try to find out if this paragraph mentions Far East, and at the same time try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph.
Facial treatment was highly developed, and women devoted many hours to it. They used to spread various scented creams on the face and to apply makeup in vivid and contrasting colors. An Egyptian papyrus from the 16th century BC contains detailed recipes to remove blemishes, wrinkles, and other signs of age. Greek and Roman women would cover their faces in the evening with a beauty mask to remove blemishes, which consisted mainly of flour mixed with fragrant spices, leaving it on their face all night. The next morning, they would wash it off with ass's milk. The very common creams used by women in the ancient Far East, particularly important in the hot climate and prevalent in that area of the globe, were made up of oils and aromatic scents. Sometimes the oil in these creams was extracted from olives, almonds, gourds, sesame, or from trees and plants. But for those of limited means, scented animal and fish fats were commonly used.
So does it mention Far East? Yes, it does. Here it mentions Far East. So now we need to read the question carefully. In ancient Far East, fish fats were used as cream by women from poor households. I think fish fats is very important. Let's read this part and see if it mentions whether fish fats were used as cream by poor women. So it says, the very common creams used by women in the ancient Far East were made up of oils. Creams were made up of oils. Sometimes the oil in these creams was extracted from these things, but for those of limited means, fish fats were commonly used. I think this is the answer. From the context, we can know it actually means sometimes oil in the creams was extracted from these things, but for poor people, fish fats were used to extract oil in the creams. So fish fats were indeed used as cream by poor women, right? So the answer is true. There is an obvious paraphrasing. Poor households is a rephrase of limited means, right? Next one. The teachings in the Bible. Okay, we don't need to continue reading. We only need to highlight the book name, Bible. We read the question only after we find the Bible in the passage. Now, I will play the audio for paragraph E. You try to find out if it mentions the Bible, and at the same time, try to understand the general meaning of the paragraph, okay?
Women in the ancient past commonly put colors around their eyes. Besides beautification, its purpose was also medicinal as covering the sensitive skin of the lids with colored ointments that prevented dryness and eye diseases. The eye paint repelled the little flies that transmitted eye inflammations. Egyptian women colored the upper eyelid black and the lower one green, and painted the space between the upper lid and the eyebrow gray or blue. The women of Mesopotamia favored yellows and reds. The use of kohl for painting the eyes is mentioned 3 times in the Bible, always with disapproval by the sages. In contrast, Job named one of his daughters Karen Hapuch, horn of eye paint.
As you can see, here it mentions Bible. So now we need to read the question carefully. The teachings in the Bible were repeatedly against the use of this for painting the eyes. I think this is very important information. Let's read this part and see if it mentions the use of this for painting the eyes. The use of this for painting the eyes, yes, it does mention it, right? This is exactly the same as this part of the question. So was the Bible against the use of this? It says the use of this for painting the eyes is mentioned 3 times in the Bible, always with disapproval by this. Although I don't know what this means, but I think this is something in the Bible, because this information explains this word, right? And I think these 3 things look like something in the Bible. So here it actually says disapproval by the Bible. Disapproval means against, right? So the Bible were actually against the use of this for painting the eyes. What about repeatedly? Yes, it says repeatedly 3 times. 3 times is just another way to say repeatedly. So this part is actually saying the use of this for painting the eyes is repeatedly disapproved by the Bible, which means exactly the same as the question. So the answer is true. Next one. Long hair as a symbol of beauty was worn solely by women of ancient cultures. This question doesn't contain any time references or place names, so which word do you think we can use to locate the answer? I think long hair is very important because the question is mainly about long hair, right? So we can use long hair to locate the answer. And as we read the next paragraph, we will immediately notice that here it mentions long hair. So now we need to read the question again. We need to analyze it. Long hair as a symbol of beauty was worn solely by women of ancient cultures. I think this information is very important. We need to find out if long hair was worn only by women. Okay, now I will play the audio for this paragraph. You try to find out if long hair was worn only by women or not, okay?
Great importance was attached to the care for hair in ancient times. Long hair was always considered a symbol of beauty, and kings, nobles, and dignitaries grew their hair long and kept it well groomed and cared for. Women devoted much time to the style of the hair. While not cutting, they would apply much care to it by arranging it skillfully in plaits and building it up, sometimes with the help of wigs. Egyptian women generally wore their hair flowing down to their shoulders, or even longer. In Mesopotamia, women cherished long hair as a part of their beauty, and hair flowing down their backs in a thick plait and tied with a ribbon is seen in art. Assyrian women wore their hair shorter, braiding and binding it in a bun at the back. In ancient Israel, brides would wear their hair long on the wedding day as a sign of their virginity. Ordinary people and slaves, however, usually wore their hair short, mainly for hygienic reasons, since they could not afford to invest in the kind of treatment that long hair required.
So which one should we choose? The whole paragraph is about women wearing long hair, right? But don't choose true. Yes, women wore long hair, but women were not the only one who wore long hair. Here it says, long hair was always considered a symbol of beauty. This is the same as this part of the question, right? And the kings, nobles grew their hair long and kept it well groomed and cared for. So kings also wore long hair. And the kings were men, right? That means men wore long hair as well. Women were not the only one who wore long hair. Men wore long hair as well. So the answer is false. Now, last one. The queen. Okay, here it has this queen's name, so we don't need to continue reading the question. We read the question after we find this name in the passage. Now, I will play the audio for the last paragraph. You try to find out if this paragraph mentions this name. Of course, it mentions this name because this is the last paragraph.
From the Bible and Egyptian and Assyrian sources, as well as the words of classical authors, it appears that the centers of the trade in aromatic resins and incense were located in the kingdoms of southern Arabia, and even as far as India, where some of these precious aromatic plants were grown. Dealers from Sheba and Ramah dealt with you, offering the choicest spices. Ezekiel 27:22. The Nabateans functioned as the important middlemen in this trade. Palestine also served as a very important component, as the trade routes crisscrossed the country. It is known that the Egyptian queen Hatshepsut, 15th century BC, sent a royal expedition to the land of Punt, Somalia, in order to bring back myrrh seedlings to plant in her temple. In Assyrian records of tribute and spoils of war, perfumes and resins are mentioned. The text from the time of Tukulti-Ninurta II, 890 to 884 BC, refers to balls of myrrh as part of the tribute brought to the Assyrian king by the Aramaean kings. The trade in spices and perfumes is also mentioned in the Bible as written in Genesis 37:25-26, camels carrying gum tragacanth and balm and myrrh.
Alright, here it mentions the queen's name, so now we need to read the question carefully. The queen sent a royal word to what? To establish a trade route for what? There are some words I don't know, but it doesn't matter, because I think the key information is this: establish a trade route for this. We need to find out if the queen established the trade route or not. As you can see, the sentence before this mentions trade routes, so let's start reading from here. This also served as a very important component as the trade route crisscrossed the country. Yes, it mentions a trade route, but so far it's unclear who established these trade routes. Let's continue reading. It is known that the queen sent a royal expedition to the land of Wat in order to bring back this to plant in her temple. This part is exactly the same as this part of the question, right? And then the paragraph says, bring back this to plant in her temple. So the paragraph only says the queen brought this back to plant in her temple. It doesn't say the queen established a trade route for this, right? Establishing a trade route is a big project. The paragraph doesn't say if the queen established a trade route or not. The paragraph only says the queen brought back this to plant in her temple. So the answer is not given. And the remaining paragraph doesn't mention the queen again, so I think the answer is not given. Now part 3. This part only has 4 true/false not given questions. Hope you guys make it to the end. So the first step is to quickly go through the question and find the locating words. Ancient China had already deployed rockets as a military purpose as early as 500 years ago. This question has a country's name and also has a time reference, so we can use them to locate the answer. Although the entire passage is about Asia, Asia has so many countries. This question specifically asks about China. So I think of course we can use China to locate the answer. And it's not just about China, it's about ancient China. It's not about modern China, right? It's about ancient China. The first paragraph does mention China, but this part has nothing to do with this question. This part is not about ancient China, and it doesn't mention this time, so we are not going to read the first paragraph. The answer is in paragraph A. As you can see, here it mentions China around 500 BC. China around 500 BC is ancient China, right? And 500 BC looks the same as 500 years ago, so now we need to read the question carefully. Ancient China had already deployed rockets as a military purpose as early as 500 years ago. These two are just locating words. I think the key information here is using rockets as a military purpose. Now, I will play the audio for this paragraph. You try to find out if it mentions China used rockets as a military purpose.
Rocket technology has progressed considerably since the days of fire arrows, bamboo poles filled with gunpowder, first used in China around 500 BC and during the Sung Dynasty to repel Mongol invaders at the Battle of Kaifeng Fu, in AD 1232.
So which one do you think is the answer? It says rocket technology first used in China around 500 BC to repel invaders at a battle. Repel invaders at a battle is using rockets as a military purpose, right? You may not know the word repel, but you must know the word battle. Using rockets at a battle is using rockets as a military purpose, right? So this part is true, and I see the paragraph uses 500 BC, which looks the same as 500 years ago, so I chose true. I got it wrong. The answer is false. 500 BC is so much earlier than 500 years ago. China first used rockets as a military purpose around 500 BC. That is to say, it should be as early as 500 BC, not 500 years ago. 500 BC is much earlier than 500 years ago, so the answer is false. Next one. Space technology has enhanced the literacy of Asia. Which word do you think is special? Obviously, we shouldn't use space technology or Asia to locate the answer because the whole passage is about space technology in Asia, right? I think literacy is very special. Now, I will play the audio for paragraph B. You try to find out if it mentions the literacy of Asia.
In the last decade, there has been a dramatic growth in space activities in Asia, both in the utilization of space-based services and the production of satellites and launchers. This rapid expansion has led many commentators and analysts to predict that Asia will become a world space power. The space age has had dramatic effects worldwide, with direct developments in space technology influencing telecommunications, meteorological forecasting, Earth resource and environmental monitoring, and disaster mitigation, flood, forest fires, and oil spills. Asian nations have been particularly eager to embrace these developments.
Alright, do you think this paragraph mentions literacy of Asia? I don't think it mentions it. Although here it mentions the influence of space technology, it doesn't refer to the influence on literacy, but refers to the influence on these areas, right? It says space technology influencing these areas. So far it seems the answer should be not given. Let's just choose not given for now and mark this question. Maybe the answer will appear in the following paragraphs. But what if the following paragraphs doesn't contain the answer to this question? If we keep looking for something that doesn't exist, we may miss the answer to the next question, right? So I think it's wise to read question 39 and do these two questions at the same time. Photos taken by satellites with certain technology help predict some natural catastrophe prevention and surveillance. Which word do you think is special? I think photos and catastrophe prevention and surveillance are both special, but this is too long and difficult to remember, so I think it's better to use photo to locate the answer. This word is short and easy to remember. Now let's read paragraph C and do these two questions at the same time. When listening to the audio, you try to find out if it mentions literacy or photos, okay?
New and innovative uses for satellites are constantly being explored with potential revolutionary effects, such as in the field of health and telemedicine, distance education, crime prevention, piracy on the high seas, food and agricultural planning and production, rice crop monitoring. Space in Asia is very much influenced by the competitive commercial space sector, the emergence of low-cost mini-satellites, and the globalization of industrial and financial markets. It is not evident how Asian space will develop in the coming decades in the face of these trends. It is, however, important to understand and assess the factors and forces that shape Asian space activities and development in determining its possible consequences for the region.
Obviously, this paragraph doesn't mention photos, right? And I think it doesn't mention literacy either. I think the only information that is relevant to literacy is distance education. Let's read this part carefully. New and innovative uses for satellites are being explored with potential revolutionary effects, such as in the field of distance education. First of all, I don't think distance education means the same as literacy. Literacy means reading and writing skills, but distance education means learning remotely. It doesn't mention literacy, right? Secondly, the question uses the present perfect tense, has enhanced. It means has already enhanced literacy of Asia. The enhancement has already been created, but the paragraph uses are being explored. It's talking about something that is happening right now. So they are currently exploring the uses for satellites. And from the word potential revolutionary effects, we can tell that they are talking about the effects in the future. They are doing this right now, and hopefully it will have great effects in the future. It's talking about the effects in the future. We don't know if right now the effects have already been created or not, so I think the answer is still not given. But maybe one of the remaining paragraphs may contain the answer to this question, so we still need to keep looking for the answer to this question. Paragraph D doesn't mention literacy or photos, so we will skip this paragraph. Paragraph E mentions photos. Here it uses the word photographs. So now we need to read this question again. We need to read it carefully. Photos taken by satellites with certain technology help predict some natural catastrophe prevention and surveillance. I think the core of this question is here. We need to find out if this paragraph talks about predict natural catastrophe prevention. Okay, now let's listen to the audio.
Asia, and Southeast Asia in particular, suffers from a long list of recurrent large-scale environmental problems, including storms and flooding, forest fires and deforestation, and crop failures. Thus, the space application that has attracted the most attention in this region is remote sensing. Remote sensing satellites equipped with instruments to take photographs of the ground at different wavelengths provide essential information for natural resource accounting, environmental management, disaster prevention and monitoring, land use mapping, and sustainable development planning.
Which one do you think is the answer? So here it says, satellites equipped with instrument. I think those satellites are satellites with certain technology. So satellites equipped with instrument to take photos of the ground, provide essential information for disaster prevention and monitoring. This means exactly the same as predicts some natural catastrophe prevention and surveillance, right? Catastrophe prevention and surveillance is just a rephrase of disaster prevention and monitoring. So obviously the answer is true. Usually answers will appear in order in the passage. That means the answer to question 30A won't appear after the answer to 39. So the answer to 30A won't appear in the remaining paragraphs. So maybe the answer is not given. Alright, let's move on to the last question. Commercial competition constitutes a boosting factor to age and technology development. Which word do you think is special? We shouldn't use age and technology to locate the answer, right? Because the entire passage is about age and technology development. I think commercial competition is special. Earlier, we have read this, right? And the remaining paragraph doesn't mention commercial competition, so we are going to skip it. The next paragraph mentions commercial competition. Now, I will play the audio for this paragraph. You try to find out where it mentions commercial competition.
In recent years, there have been fundamental changes in the way satellites are designed and built to drastically reduce costs. The emergence of small satellites and their quick adoption by Asian countries as a way to develop low-cost satellite technology and rapidly establish a space capability has given these countries the possibility to shorten their learning curve by a decade or more. The global increase of technology transfer mechanisms and use of readily available commercial technology to replace costly space and military standard components may very well result in a highly competitive Asian satellite manufacturing industry.
As you can see here, it mentions competition. Competitive Asian satellite manufacturing industry. So now we need to read the question again. Commercial competition constitutes a boosting factor to Asian technology development. So basically this question is saying competition boosts technology development. Now let's read this sentence and see if it mentions competition boosts technology development. The global increase of technology transfer mechanisms and use of readily available commercial technology to replace costly space and military standard components may very well result in a highly competitive Asian satellites manufacturing industry. So according to this sentence, which one do you think is the answer? I got this one wrong. I chose not given, but the answer is true. So it says these two factors may very well result in a highly competitive industry. So these two factors will make the industry competitive. But I think we don't know if this competition will lead to technology development. So I think the answer is not given. Maybe the word competitive has a double meaning. It means competition and development. I don't know. If you know why the answer is true, please let us know the reason in the comment section. That's it for this reading test. I think not given is the hardest option. Usually if the answer is not given, the question and the paragraph talk about different things. For example, the question says literacy. However, the paragraph says distance education. Distance education and literacy are two different things, right? The paragraph doesn't mention literacy. Also, this question. The question says establishing a trade route for this, whereas the paragraph says bringing back this to plant in her temple. These are two different concepts, right? The paragraph doesn't mention establishing a trade route, so the answer is not given. And here are all the tips we covered in this video. Finally, don't forget to check out our 3-day Writing Test 2 challenge. This challenge has helped many of our students improve their writing scores. I will put a link in the pinned comment. Don't forget to check it out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope to see you soon in the next video.